Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. A warm welcome and a special shout out to those of you who are up early or late in various time zones to join our event today. We really appreciate your interest. My name is Olivia Coldry and I head up the energy finance work at Sustainable Energy for All. And on behalf of SEforALL and our co-host, the Climate Policy Initiative, I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this virtual launch of our new knowledge brief on coal power finance in high impact countries. We have a very exciting lineup for you today, if I do say so. I'll shortly hand over to my colleague at CPI in San Francisco, Kyle Blocher, who will set the scene with a presentation of the knowledge brief's key findings and recommendations. And then we'll switch pretty quickly to a panel discussion on the persistent problem of coal power finance, where we're going to hear perspectives from really quite a stellar panel of Vibhuti Garg, Rebecca Shirley, and Patrick Tunui, who I'll introduce in more detail a bit later on key takeaways from the research. So we have about a 20-minute panel discussion, and we want to leave plenty of time for audience Q&A. So we have about 15 minutes towards the end of the session for your questions and to answer them. So just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording the session, so for those colleagues and associates who can't make it, we're happy to provide a recording afterwards. And as we go through Kyle's presentation and the panel discussion, please feel free to ask your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we're going to try and get to as many as we can. We hope you have lots of questions and we have a great panel to answer them, so please do that. Before we dive into the presentation and discussion, I want to take just a few moments to outline the context of this research. For those of you who are not familiar with our organisation, SEforALL is an international organisation working in partnership with the UN and with leaders in the public and private sectors, as well as civil society, very importantly, to drive progress on SDG 7, which, as many of us will know, calls for access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all by 2030. So for the last few years, since 2017, SEforALL and CPI have partnered to pretty comprehensively track finance for electricity and clean cooking access in Africa and Asia through our flagship Energising Finance research series. So the knowledge brief we're launching today on coal finance is part of this ongoing work. As I won't need to repeat, climate change is really arguably our gravest threat, and we're running out of time to mitigate its potentially disastrous impacts. And if we're going to have any hope of reaching a net zero economy by 2050 and SDG 7 by 2030, we as a global community really must ramp up our efforts to phase coal out of our energy systems, which will be explored in some detail today. But precisely when we need more ambitious action on this front, we're continuing to see investment in fossil fuel projects, especially coal, in countries with high rates of energy poverty. And to make matters worse, the volume of finance needed to help deliver SDG 7 in those same countries is really woefully short of what's needed. As our knowledge brief highlights, although finance for the global coal industry is drying up, and despite all of the socio-economic and climate risks associated with coal-fired power, which are very well known now, some developing countries still see coal as an important part of their energy mix, and there's still money around to fund it. So the reasons for this are precisely why we embarked on this knowledge brief and what we've investigated in this research. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Kyle Blocher, who's an analyst at CPI and the driving force behind this research. He's been the lead author of the knowledge brief on coal power finance in high impact countries. And Kyle is going to present a summary of its main findings and recommendations. So Kyle, over to you, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Olivia. Hopefully you all can see the screen here now. Again, the inception of this knowledge brief stems from the findings of last year's Energising Finance series, which found a spike in finance commitments for new coal in 2018 among a subset of countries that are home to the highest total populations lacking access to electricity. This group of countries is referred to herein as high impact countries, or HICs. 2018 marked the first time in at least the 6 years that SEforALL and CPI have been tracking finance, the commitments for new grid-connected fossil fuels exceeded those for renewables. So we wanted to understand which HICs are still receiving coal finance commitments, what are the sources of those finance, why do these trends persist, and how can we improve access to electricity without relying on coal moving forward. First, we examined which HICs have continued to receive finance commitments for new grid-connected coal projects. Currently, 8 of the 18 countries analyzed still have active coal power plants under development, including Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan in South Asia, along with Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, and Tanzania in Sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given its size, India is home to the majority of coal projects under development. However, as illustrated in the chart at the bottom of the slide, finance commitments to build new coal plants in India are slowing compared to those other HICs and have accounted for only 17% of such finance commitments since 2016. Meanwhile, $28 billion of finance has been committed to build new coal projects in other HICs since 2016. This figure is largely driven by an effort by Bangladesh to increase its coal fleet, which culminated in an influx of finance commitments in 2018. But Pakistan and a number of African HICs have also attracted significant finance commitments for new coal. In addition to the decreasing volume of new finance commitments for coal projects in India, the policy environment in India is complex, unique among HICs, and well covered in broader literature, including the forthcoming Understanding the Landscape report, which is also part of SEforALL's Energizing Finance series. Therefore, this knowledge brief focuses on coal finance dynamics in HICs which have been less well publicized. In the wake of economic challenges faced by recently commissioned coal plants in Bangladesh and Pakistan, as will be discussed in greater detail shortly, both countries announced moratoriums on new coal plant development in 2020. Though both countries have cited plans for continued reliance on fossil fuels, they've also recognized the need to emphasize renewable generation. Unlike in South Asia, coal is absent from the electricity mix in sub-Saharan African HICs, but several African governments maintain energy policies favorable to coal in an attempt to improve electrification. As in the case of finance demand, the landscape of coal finance supply is dynamic, as financiers are responding to the evolving economic and geopolitical considerations of coal power. The market for new coal finance has contracted at an accelerating rate since 2013, when the World Bank and the European Investment Bank adopted coal exclusion policies. Since then, multilateral development banks have continued to act as climate leaders, with 7 of the 8 largest MDBs having now announced coal exclusion policies. These announcements are reflected in teal boxes in the timeline at the bottom of the screen. National governments, which are shown in purple at the bottom of the slide, have also begun excluding finance for new coal projects at an accelerating rate in recent years, culminating in May of 2021, when South Korea and the G7 nations all announced an end to new finance for coal projects. This is particularly significant as Japan and South Korea have combined for nearly 1/3 of all international finance commitments to new coal projects by public funders. Beyond the G7, additional partnerships have been launched in an attempt to coordinate decarbonization efforts of public and private actors. Such partnerships include the Powering Past Coal Alliance and, most recently, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was organized ahead of COP26 as part of the UN's Race to Zero campaign. The sheer quantity of financial institutions that are signing on to such partnerships appears promising and is indeed a positive signal. The 4 largest commercial banks in the United States, the 3 largest banks in the UK, and the 9 largest banks in mainland Europe have all made net zero commitments. Additionally, 53 financial institutions, representing nearly 1/4 of global banking assets, have joined the UN's Net Zero Banking Alliance. And signatories of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative have also committed to a pathway to net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner. For the time being, however, these commitments have largely remained merely a positive signal, having failed to yield much in the way of tangible progress towards decarbonization. While most major commercial lenders excluded direct project finance for new coal projects, they've continued to fund the balance sheets of coal project developers at scale. Meanwhile, American asset managers Vanguard and BlackRock have combined investments of $170 billion in the global coal industry, despite being signatories to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. Given how porous these decarbonization commitments have been in practice, commercial financial institutions remain the single largest source of coal finance in the world. However, this picture changes when focusing on HIC specifically, as public finance has comprised 60% of commitments for new coal projects since 2013, most of which have come from abroad. This is in stark contrast to the finance for new renewable generation, where private domestic investors alone have comprised nearly 60% of total finance commitments during the same timeframe, as shown in the pie charts at the bottom of the slide. Digging deeper into the sources of finance for new coal projects in HICs, we can see that Chinese institutions account for the majority of both public and private international finance, as shown in the updated pie chart to the right of the slide. In total, Chinese financiers have accounted for 40% of finance commitments for new coal power plants and HICs since 2013. The reasons for such high volumes of coal finance from China trace back to the late 1990s and into the 2000s, when China invested heavily in its domestic coal industry. Following the Paris Agreement, China began refocusing its domestic energy policy away from coal and towards renewables. As a result, China's coal industry had outgrown domestic demand for new coal projects, leading to surplus capacity. Financing coal projects abroad, therefore, provides an opportunity for China to prop up employment in its domestic coal industry, as commitments to finance international coal projects often come with physical coal infrastructure, as well as engineering, procurement, and construction services. Though it's ultimately up to recipient countries to demand new coal infrastructure, the suite of services and favorable financing terms offered by China make for a compelling value proposition. However, China has been showing signs that it's moving away from coal finance. In 2019, China established the BRI International Green Development Coalition, which discourages coal investment under the Belt and Road Initiative. Further, 2020 marks the first year in which renewables comprise the majority of BRI energy sector investments at 57%. Coal finance commitments have already had significant negative impacts in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and threaten to have similar impacts for African HICs that continue to pursue new coal project development. Among HICs, the two largest destinations for Chinese coal finance have been Bangladesh and Pakistan, both of which commissioned new coal-fired power plants in recent years prior to announcing their respective moratoriums on coal development. Slower than expected electricity demand growth, paired with underdeveloped grid infrastructure, have limited capacity utilization to below 40% in both countries, effectively stranding new coal plants upon commissioning. This is problematic for two reasons. First, Bangladesh and Pakistan were obligated to make capacity payments to coal plant operators of $1.1 and $5.3 billion, respectively, in 2018 alone, with these figures expected to grow in the coming years. The second reason that underutilization of coal plants is financially problematic has to do with the comparative cost of coal plants relative to alternative energy sources. The chart shown here reflects average levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, of coal, solar, and wind generation technologies across non-OECD countries. LCOE reflects the average cost it takes to generate each megawatt hour of electricity over the course of an asset's lifetime. Therefore, as capacity utilization for coal plants fall, upfront investment costs and ongoing overhead costs must be spread over fewer units of electricity produced, increasing the total effective cost of electricity. The effect of a reduction in capacity utilization from 85% to 50% is illustrated in the light gray portion of the chart, which represents a 24% increase in coal plant LCOE. Though infrastructure constraints and low demand growth have been the drivers of underutilization in Bangladesh and Pakistan to date, the long-term economic viability of coal plants is further challenged by cheap renewable generation. Looking to the right of the chart, you can see that the total cost of new solar power is, on average, cheaper than that of operating a coal plant at 85% capacity utilization. As the price of renewables continue to fall, it will be increasingly economically attractive to simply build and operate new renewables than to operate existing coal plants. Such investment rationale increases stranded asset risks for coal plants. These stranded asset risks associated with subpar infrastructure in the near term and displacement by renewables in the long term are also relevant for African HICs developing new coal infrastructure. The combination of grid fragmentation, deterioration, unreliability, and size limitations across African HICs increase the risk that any newly commissioned coal plants will face the same challenges of underutilization caused by subpar Bangladeshi and Pakistani infrastructure. These constraints may be even more pronounced in Africa, however, as electrification rates range from 38% in Tanzania down to only 11% in Malawi. Despite the dire need for new generation capacity to increase these electrification rates as quickly as possible, the large, centralized nature of coal plants prevent them from being effectively absorbed into existing grid infrastructure, thereby preventing them from ultimately increasing electricity access figures. What's more, developing a new coal plant in an African HIC without a developed coal industry is more costly than building a new coal plant in a country such as India or China, which have robust coal industries developed over the course of decades. Beyond costly transmission lines, coal plants also require either ports to import international coal or coal mines to extract domestic coal, rail systems to transport the coal to power plants, and a workforce to be trained to support the entire coal power supply chain, from coal mining to plant operations and maintenance. Reliance on imported coal would increase a country to increase energy security risks in the long term, as well as fuel price volatility. Although utilizing domestic coal would alleviate these concerns, it would also expose a country's population to adverse health and safety risks of coal mining. In either case, development of new coal industry would expose a country's workforce to skill obsolescence in the mid to long term, as coal plants face increased stranded asset risks. These challenges of developing new coal projects may help to explain why coal generation has not taken hold in Sub-Saharan African HICs to date, as 91% of all planned coal power plants in African HICs has been either shelved or canceled, leaving 1.9 gigawatts under development across 5 African HICs currently. Ultimately, the scope of this work is focused on a pathway towards achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goal 7 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Beyond the obvious misalignment of coal with environmental sustainability, it also falls short of achieving even the energy access targets of SDG 7. As discussed, underdeveloped transmission infrastructure in HICs leaves large populations without grid connectivity, preventing coal and other centralized generation technologies from advancing energy access for large populations currently unconnected to grid infrastructure. Conversely, renewables, namely solar, can be deployed in decentralized installations at the distribution level, avoiding the need for costly and time-intensive development of transmission infrastructure. Due to the time intensity of developing and commissioning new coal projects, it's also infeasible for coal to improve reliability in the near term by 2030. The median development timeline for all electricity sector investments made by the World Bank in the 15 years prior to the Paris Agreement was 9 years. indicating that the past methods of electrification do not meet the urgency of today. Conversely, renewable generation can be developed and commissioned in less than half the amount of time of thermal generation on average. Finally, as we look to improve the quality of electricity access for those facing challenges of resilience and dependability, battery storage technologies look to be a cost-effective and environmentally sustainable method of balancing intermittency of renewables, avoiding the need for dispatchable coal generation in the long term. After precipitous cost declines to date, the price of lithium-ion batteries is expected to fall another 40% by 2030. Meanwhile, advancements in new battery technologies promise improved application for long-duration grid-scale storage. Moving forward, there are tangible steps that stakeholders can take to mobilize finance towards sustainable energy for all. On the supply side, commercial investors must more thoroughly scrutinize the downstream uses of finance to ensure that their capital is not ultimately funneled through subsidiaries and into new coal project development. And also provide near to midterm targets for decarbonization, rather than far-off goals such as net zero by 2050. Chinese public financiers have already made such intermediate steps towards decarbonization in the domestic context. By applying the same rationale for its investment decisions abroad, China has an opportunity to align its overseas energy investments with the broader international public finance community. In order to hold nations responsible for the export of high emissions finance abroad, the international community should also consider a finance-based carbon accounting regime. Unlike the geography-based regime currently relied upon to measure progress towards decarbonization commitments, a finance-based carbon accounting regime would hold nations responsible for their impact on global emissions, rather than just those originating from within their borders. On the demand side, HICs have the opportunity to reimagine what an electric system can look like to meet today's challenges. First, deployment of distributed renewable energy provides the clearest path to realizing universal electricity access as quickly as possible, in line with SDG 7. When considering total system costs inclusive of transmission infrastructure, distributed renewables are also the least cost option for electrification in the near term, while investment in transmission infrastructure and large-scale renewables look to be the least cost option to generate electricity at scale in the long term. Finally, battery storage cost declines and technology improvements provide a pathway to sustainably and effectively balance the intermittency of renewables, improving the quality of electricity access among HICs in the long term. And with that, I'd again like to welcome all of you to type any questions that you may have into the chat box, and I'll pass the microphone back to Olivia and our panel members who will discuss these themes in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carl. Terrific. And thank you for summarizing a huge amount of work so succinctly, and for all the research and writing you've done on this brief. It's a really fantastic piece of work. It was published today. For those audience members who haven't had a chance to look yet, please go to CPI's website or our own, SEforALL, and you'll find the brief in its entirety. But with that, I'm really excited now to turn the discussion over to our panelists, who I'll now invite to turn their cameras on if they're not already, and who I'll introduce a little more thoroughly. So first of all, sitting in Delhi, we have Dr. Vibhuti Garg, who's energy economist and the lead for India at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Vibhuti has a ton of experience in the energy sector, and her work currently at IEFA promotes sustainable development through influencing policy interventions on energy pricing, subsidy reform, enhancing clean energy access to capital, and increasing private participation. So really warm welcome to you, Vibhuti. Thank you for being on our steering committee this year for this work, as has been Rebecca Shirley, who I'll introduce next. So Dr. Shirley is Director of Research, Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute in Africa. Again, a ton of experience in the energy sector. Currently, she's working to create widespread public access to high quality data and insights for mobilizing sustainable development scenarios. And she has over 14 years experience leading energy and environmental research across Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. So a real breadth of geographic experience. So welcome to you too, Rebecca. Last but not least, Patrick Tunui, who's Head of Policy and Regional Strategy at Gogla, who's been one of SEforALL's long-standing partners. Patrick's an experienced professional also, with over 15 years experience in the public and private sectors, conducting private sector development, investment and trade promotion and support, hugely important to the solar industry. Prior to joining Gogla, Patrick was embedded by the IFC with the Kenya Private Sector Alliance to drive reform efforts to improve the business climate in Kenya and the East African communities. So Vibhuti, Rebecca and Patrick, a very warm welcome to you. I hope everyone agrees that we have a very heavy intellectual bench here to draw from, which I'm thrilled to do. So without further ado, I'll turn to Vibhuti, please, for the first question, and interested in your reactions. You know, all we hear about coal is bad press. And we have calls from the likes of the UN Secretary General and the International Energy that we should all be walking away from coal at once. So in light of this, tell us, especially sitting in India, why would governments, especially in developing countries, continue to entertain a role for coal in their energy mix?
Thanks, Olivia. Yes, coal is still kind of considered a mainstay by a lot of government entities in the developing countries. The reason I believe is for the government kind of lay emphasis on coal is that they want to meet goals of energy security, enhance energy access, and meet other development goals like providing jobs to their population, as a large chunk of population is kind of dependent on coal for employment. In India, for example, there is a lot to push, promote domestic manufacturing and also push domestic resources and reduce reliance on imports. So given that there is a huge source of revenue for the from these fossil fuels, so moving away means increasing kind of fiscal deficit for the country. So that's why they do want to keep exploring and producing more and more coal. But last year, on account of COVID-19 pandemic, when all the countries closed their borders, economies which were relying hugely on imports suffered a huge setback. So that again also kind of, influence or was one of the drivers that again kind of influence the mindset of these governments to push back to their own resources. Even for RE deployment, for instance, there was scarcity of modules and other inputs that led to many countries to further boost their own resources, even at the cost of climate change. While renewable energy is cheaper, but other technologies like offshore wind, green hydrogen, and more importantly, battery storage or pumped hydro, which are flexible generation resources that can help in better RE grid integration, is expensive, and cost is a big driver for making energy choices. So till the time these energy resources become cheap, there will be some continuance of reliance on coal to meet the energy demand.
Oh, thanks very much, Vibhuti. You've covered a lot of ground there, and coming from a coal exporting country, Australia, we look at this through a different lens as well as what is the ongoing demand going to be. So that's very insightful to understand the drivers a little bit better. And I'm going to sort of continue with you, if you don't mind, and turn to the supply side.
Sure.
So we've heard from Kyle about where the money is coming from. You do a lot of this work at IEFA. What's driving this continued investment? So in light of all the net zero pledges, all the alliances, what's driving the continued investment despite these net zero pledges, and what risks does it give rise to those investors?
Yeah, you are right. The global electricity transition is happening, but not happening fast enough to limit, global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. So we need more commitment to no more coal financing. Even IEA highlighted in their energy outlook this year that, in order to meet these goals, we have to stop any more investment into these fossil fuels, whether it's coal or oil and gas. Let me give you an example from India, why there is still an increased investment or some part of financial institutions are still lending to the coal sector. The banking sector in India, is struggling with huge or sitting on about US 40 to 60 billion of non-performing or stranded coal assets, but still they have to finance coal-based assets. They are all public sector banks. I think somebody did pose this question, that it's more of public sector lending and not private sector banks, which are lending to fossil fuels. Given there is government guarantee and the banks and the companies get bailed out, that support is causing these banks to still lend to the coal sector. Otherwise, if you look at from the commercial viability or from the competitiveness of these coal sector, it has lost its sheen. But given that there is a strong backing from the government and they know that they will be bailed out at one point or the other, so they continue to lend. However, there is a shift happening and there is increasing pressure from the board members to these financial institutions, to these banks, to these assets owners to shift their strategy. If you look at the share price performance of Peabody Energy, which is a global pure play coal company, and ExxonMobil, another oil and gas company listed in US, they have massively underperformed in the share price benchmark. So ExxonMobil, to an extent, they have destroyed US dollars 150 billion, or more than 50% of their shareholder wealth just to date till about 2020. So if you consider even this year, the amount is going to be much higher. So there is some level of, rethink that is being required in terms of the financing to such loss-making fuels. And I said that, these decisions are being considered and are being made purely on economic basis, as these companies are profit-making entities and want to earn higher returns on their investment. I did highlight it earlier. So now with declining renewable energy prices, and even Kyle pointed out that the battery storage prices are going to go down in the near future. So these energy choices or these resources will become more competitively viable, and we will see that switch happening. But till that time, I believe there is some continuance in terms of financing of these coal assets. And at IFA, we did track how many organizations or how many financial institutions have shifted away from coal. So the number has been to some extent good. We have tracked about 180 globally significant banks, insurers, and asset managers or owners that have shifted away from coal financing policy. But as we were talking earlier as well, that still there is some left for them to do actually walk the talk.
Thanks very much for your insights, and sort of particularly apposite, given that India does represent so much of the active coal activity globally still. So in some respects, it's a unique case, but certainly gives rise to a lot of learnings for the rest of us. With that, we might shift geographies, and I might turn to Rebecca, please, for the next question. And notice if you can give us, and especially those of us who are not sitting in Africa, a sense of demand and supply dynamics for coal plants in Africa, please.
Thanks, Olivia, and hi to everyone, fellow panelists and the audience. So let me just start with a few stats, because as you said, Olivia, many people might be joining in from all over the world and not so familiar with the Africa region. So the region's electricity generating capacity has actually changed quite little in the past 20 years. And data from the IEA Energy Database shows that we're actually sitting at about 200 gigawatts of total installed capacity across the entire continent. That's less than a third of India alone, where Vibhuti was just talking about. So just want to sort of, in terms of scale, you can see we're talking about an entire continent's energy capacity that's less than that of India. Now, out of that 200 gigawatts, about 54 gigawatts of that, so roughly a quarter, is in coal. And out of that quarter of 54 gigawatts, 46 of those gigawatts are in South Africa. So that's about 85% of Africa's coal just sitting in South Africa. The remainder is maybe 4 megawatts in Morocco and a few isolated plants elsewhere. And if you look at WRI's global power plant database, you can see the actual locations of each of these. And there are 22 new coal power plants in various stages of discussion, which total about 13 gigawatts. Now, as Kyle was very clear in his presentation, more than 90% of those have already been canceled. And that makes sense, right? Because outside of South Africa, where there is a coal pipeline, for other African countries, this would mean new coal supply chains, new supporting infrastructure, new ancillary investments. So it sort of makes sense. So all of that to say that the demand for coal in Africa right now is actually very low, sometimes contrary to its outsized representation in coal finance conversations. But as Kyle said, coal generation has really not taken hold in Sub-Saharan Africa to date outside of South Africa, and there doesn't seem to be a viable coal pipeline in the future here. But of course, we know that sometimes it's the supply side that can be the dominant driver, right? And I think that's alluding to your question. And so the expansion of Chinese involvement in Africa's energy sector has attracted a lot of academic and public attention, especially now as it's quote unquote the last man standing in overseas finance for coal projects abroad. And what some of that research, from organizations like EEG and IEA is suggesting is that the majority of Chinese state-owned enterprises that are operating here in Africa are contractors from the energy infrastructure sector with strong expertise in coal and hydropower, needing to sort of deploy that expertise and those workforces here as opportunities for coal and hydro close down very quickly elsewhere. And further to that, Chinese state control over the operation of these SOEs is sometimes unclear, as their behavior can often contradict even with the Chinese government's own promises and articulated strategy. So that's a quick and simplified explanation, but together I think those trends sort of explain the supply side and why hydropower and coal contracts continue to dominate the current Chinese project pipeline in the sub-Saharan African region, though of course you can see that that's changing a bit, right? We just saw here in Kenya the cancellation of Lamu coal power plant last year. And so that's changing. And the question that we're now trying to answer at WRI is how to shift those investments into other areas, because that's what really is needed here, not so much a conversation of how to get the finance out of spaces, since that space is so small here, but really how to get it into those big looming vacuums around, as Kyle was saying, grid modernization, grid storage, utility scale renewables, and of course, decentralized solutions for last mile energy access.
Fascinating. Thanks very much, Rebecca. There's a ton in what you've just said. You're quite correct that as India is a special case on the demand side, China really is a special case on the supply side for all of the reasons that you've explained that Kyle went into. And you've also highlighted right at the end there the electricity access gap in Africa and a big space to fill. So I think that's a good segue to ask Patrick about the issue. So Patrick, you're a Googler and you've had a long professional background in trade and private sector development. Tell us about the alternative. So there's not much demand for coal plants outside South Africa. And tell us about renewable energy's role in the transition in Africa specifically, and what role government might play in helping that transition occur, or in fact hindering it. So love to hear your insights.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, good evening, morning to everybody, wherever you are. I think, thank you for the question, because it pivots to an area that I think I'd like to approach, particularly from the off-grid sector as we look at this issue. So yes, when we look at renewables and we look at what the off-grid sector in renewables is doing, we are offering climate smart, environmentally responsible ways to address energy access as well as energy generation and delivery. However, I think as we look at the background of what's enabling some of this finance, in many ways, it's informed by an ongoing focus on development needs tied to more grid, or the lack of development or slow development tied to a perception around there's restrained development because there's not enough generation capacity. And therefore, they've been investing a lot in building up the generation capacity. And then when you add on top of that, the current weak utilities you've got in many of the countries, and we've seen this over the past year, particularly as we've been doing some work here in Kenya, that as the national utilities struggle, they look at distributed or other solutions as competitive to the grid. I recall when we were talking to one of the legislators here, and because the national utility has been struggling, they were like, we've got excess capacity. We don't need to be investing in or supporting distributed technologies, because we should be supporting the national grid and delivering energy from the grid. And when you now add to that, the other factor that we've seen is right now in most of the countries, I mean, East Africa, you look at Kenya, you look at Ethiopia with the large dam coming online, you look at the investment in a country like Uganda in grid generation, and there is nowhere for that power to go, because both the need or the demand locally and the grid network is just not there. That you're in this scenario where people will be forced to, you've got capacity generated, and the governments are focusing on policy measures to support these large projects, be it coal powered or others, to bring power to the grid, but they cannot deliver. They're at the same time under investing or under supporting distributed energy technologies, because these are perceived as taking away from the strength of the utilities. So for us, I think when you look at energy delivery and what we are providing, be it in all the countries across most of Sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of people across the continent live without access to a grid. And even as we talk about providing or building up grid capacity generation, the investment into providing and bringing that grid to the consumers is just not there. But we are providing that through distributed energy solutions, either standalone or through mini grids. Today we are delivering that. We are meeting the energy demands for the customers and the consumers wherever they live. But the public finance remains a struggle. Investing and generating that and enabling that, because of this perceived competition between the grid technologies and the distributed energy technologies. And I think this is really an important conversation to have right now. And I think it's something we'd really love to see more focus go towards.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That's terrific. And then there's so little money going around for electricity in Africa that it's, yeah, unfortunately, it is sometimes seen as an either or in terms of investment in off-grid renewables or grid-connected renewables. So that's difficult. You'll see more about that in our Energising Finance work to be released in a month's time. I have a ton of questions for the panel, but I'm going to hold back because we have a ton of questions from the audience, which is great. So I think as a nice segue, Vibhuti, I'm going to turn to you with a similar question. So Patrick has spoken to sort of policy settings in Africa. I have a question from an audience, which I'll turn to you, and it's specific to South Asia. What level of policy changes can speed renewables investment in South Asia? For example, reducing taxes, increasing government subsidies, reducing interest rates for industries committed towards renewables. How can that help speed up the energy transition? So be keen to hear what you prescribe as good policy.
I think, yeah, one of the reasons that we are still seeing these coal and other fossil fuels still kind of, still being new development happening is through government subsidy support. Because if you compare the market prices, renewable energy is far more cheaper in most parts of the world now. So definitely on commercial grounds, they don't stand up. It's only through government support that they are being made commercially viable. I can just give you an instant very recently that Indian government had laid out some environmental compliance norms for coal washing or for pollution control technologies that had to be adopted by all these coal plants in order to make them more cleaner. But they have been extending these timelines over and over again. And again, last year, they have extended these timelines for another 3 years. So it's only by 2025 that these plants have to comply with these environmental norms. Given that there is a huge capital investment required, and that would have further deteriorated the competitiveness of these coal plants. So, the government has given an extension so that they are still being able to dispatch at market level. Otherwise, on their own, they won't be able to kind of compete with the renewable energy. So these kinds of policy uncertainties needs to be done away with, and government needs to take hard stance in terms of whatever coal capacities that are existing now. So they need to be complying with those environmental norms, and secondly, need to accelerate decommissioning of such plants. So most of these developing countries are facing with capital scarcity. So kind of helping or getting more finance for decommissioning or early closure or retirement of these plants, can be another way. And thirdly, I would say there needs to be some kind of market signals. So for example, in most parts of the world or in developing countries, there is no time of day pricing. So we need such market signals for to ensure that renewable energy plus the flexible generation resources are being able to dispatch, and there is a market for such sources. So I think these are some of the changes that needs to be undertaken.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. I'm going to turn back to baseload renewables generation for a moment. And Rebecca, I'm going to ask you a question about the African context again. How do you see in this landscape the technical and financial challenges of providing baseload generation through renewables, especially in Africa? And how do we best plan for that from a policy perspective?
Some of the answers that Vibhuti gave actually are so applicable over here. So that was a great answer from her. But let me again start with some statistics, because before addressing the challenge of providing baseload generation for Sub-Saharan Africa is actually the challenge of using existing baseload generation. And what do I mean by that? So we established earlier on that the very limited capacity on the continent in terms of generation is low. But where it exists, would you believe that consumption is also low? On average, electricity generation in Sub-Saharan Africa is actually only 40% of the potential output given its installed capacity. And that's according to the UN. So you can just think of the dams of Congo that are sitting at 10%, 15% utilization, or vast hydro capacity in Uganda that sits idle, and you can kind of start to visualize that. And these low capacity utilization rates indicate major inefficiencies and governance challenges in the electricity sector. And more importantly, the severe underinvestment in transmission and distribution infrastructure that results in under-maintained, often unoperable generation capacity. And of course, that then reflects in the low levels of industrialization in the region. So I would say that quality and reliability, of course, are key to this vision that we have for industrialization, and therefore a major need in terms of financing is really for grid modernization, so that we can actually make use of the existing baseload, the existing generation that we do have first and foremost. Why is that a challenge? I think, when you get to grid modernization, these are not simple power purchase agreements, that are based on kilowatt hour sales. Who owns this infrastructure, especially when it crosses or spans country lines? And in fact, some of those sovereignty challenges are what keep power pools and power trading quite limited on the continent. Let me just say one other thing, that aside from grid modernization, I think is the challenge around support to grow sectors that can offtake power for growth and jobs creation. So just a quick example again here in Kenya, KPLC has some less than 10,000 commercial industrial customers in a country of 45 million people. And those few customers account for 80% of the utilities consumption. So that gives you a sense of scale for industry and the major investment that's also needed in growing commercial and industrial sectors like agricultural value addition chains and so on, to kind of sop up and absorb that existing capacity that we have online. And then third, once we have that grid modernization and those sectors to absorb the power, then of course, as Kyle was suggesting earlier on, is that need for finance around the clean energy technologies themselves. But leveraging renewables as base load means being able to dispatch the power that's generated and ramp it up and down as needed while balancing frequency and regulating voltage. So once we've got these modernized grids with sufficient storage, that's really key to the investment that would be needed for clean energy technologies to be dispatchable. And Kyle's last slide was all about that. So that's for me sort of the prioritization. Let's make use of what we have. Let's make sure that our grids are capable of dispatching that power, and then let's invest in renewables with storage.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca. That's very clear. And I think it's a nice segue for a question I'd like to ask to Patrick on this sort of long-term energy sector planning in countries. I mean, sort of the social, economic, climate, environmental benefits of renewables are quite clear. Tell us about, from your work at Gogola's perspective, how the message about integrated energy planning is getting through to governments in Africa, and the extent to which policymakers are able to draw and see the benefits of the full range of technologies in the energy mix. So just interested, I mean, you work on this day to day. Tell us about how governments see this and what we might do to sort of help influence.
Thank you. I think that's really a good question for especially for us. And I think it ties to both the response from Vibhuti and Rebecca. For us, I think it's a reality. You have to accept the fact that there is going to need to be an integrated energy mix in terms of both the generation, but for us also the delivery of energy into the future. We see some countries are really ahead of this right now. You look at countries like Kenya, where their electrification plan has recognized that there are places that the grid is unlikely to reach in the foreseeable future, and they've mapped out the country, and they're saying that distributed energy technologies, both in mini grids and off-grid or standalone solutions, will be part of their mix in the future. We see a country like Ethiopia in their energy mix or in their energy plan, they've provided a roadmap for a window of time for where distributed technologies will be in place, so that by 2030, everybody has it. And then in the longer term, if the grid arrives, it arrives. But then we also see some places where there's a reluctance to recognize that there's really a role either in weak grids or unreliable grids, where it's really the right thing to try and have these standalone or other solutions in the mix. And in this regard, for example, we look at the work we're trying to do in India. On paper, India does have, it's over 99% energy access, but when you look at off-grid, our annual market data reports from Gogla, it remains one of the largest markets for our products. And what's driving it is because the customers are living in unreliable or weak grid systems where they need something else to bridge those gaps. And we think that it's really important for policy to allow for a role for these other solutions, so that at the end, be it a business customer or a home use customer, they have the highest level of energy service available, and accepting that we need to coexist. And I think this is something we are not yet seeing, especially in some of the countries, but I think more and more countries, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, are embracing the need to plan out their energy landscape and are providing ways that that we are part of the mix, and are providing for it both in policy, looking at how they can support it and scale it up, and really enable that we are able to maximize our impact for the consumers. But I think this remains something that a lot of work needs to be done to really convince policymakers to accept that there is a role for these distributed energy technologies, and they should not only accept them reluctantly, but also plan and incentivize them so that we can deliver it at the least cost possible. We still try to serve consumers who are living in rural, poor communities that affordability is a huge constraint. And if some of the incentives and support that's going to the utilities or to the large systems is also provided a little bit to off-grid customers, it would help really bring down the cost for everybody.
Okay, excellent, Patrick, thank you. Everybody, I saw you nodding your head during that answer from Patrick. I wonder if you'd like to say a few words about, I mean, India is such a huge country, such a huge population, just on that very issue of the quality of access in India and how that might be improved.
Yeah, as Patrick rightly mentioned, while most of the households in India are now connected with the grid supply, grid power, but reliability and quality of power still remains an issue. And that is the reason what most of the poor kind of consumer does is they do stacking up of different sources. So while they would have grid connected power on one hand, because they take pride, I think there is this pride issue that, you know, there is an electricity wire coming to our home. So they do want to get connected, but then they realize that that power is not available when they need it, and especially during night hours. So the productivity gets impacted, their work does get impacted. So they do stack up with other sources. They do have other decentralized renewable energy resource also being available, because they still can't rely on grid connected power. So it kind of, I feel there's an added cost which needs to be avoided. So why to get into a grid connected power when you can't serve those consumers well? So rather than build up either microgrids, mini grids, or decentralized renewable energy solutions at their end, there are especially areas with difficult terrain, and there are also issues of density of population, which does not make grid connected viable at a lot of places. So there has to be a mixed approach, and clearly even the Indian government is realizing that, and there is a lot of focus on rooftop solar, especially by CNI consumers. And that is again being driven by cost economics more than anything else, because the Indian tariff are designed in such a way that CNI consumers, the commercial and industrial consumers, are cross-subsidizing the other consumers, and they have to pay a very, very expensive or a high price for consuming energy from the grid. And for them, rooftop solar becomes more commercially viable. And given that India is an agricultural economy, so there is a lot of emphasis again on solar irrigation in India, which can help meet agricultural demand. So that's another decentralized renewable energy solution that India is banking on. So it's now we are increasingly seeing a mixed approach.
Okay, no, terrific. We're conscious. I'm conscious of the time here. We have only a few minutes left, so I'm just going to ask one more question from the floor, from the audience, and I'll go to you first, Vibhuti, again. How do we deal with existing coal plants? So how do we close them down early, and how do we incentivize their retirement? Sort of interested in your views first, and then I might go to Rebecca on the same question.
Yeah, quickly, I alluded to this point before that there would be need of finance. Especially in the developing countries, finance is a big scarcity. So getting finance to help these plant closures early, I think that can enable in decommissioning of these plants, and maybe using that space for building renewable energy plants. And that would be another way of kind of compensating some of the people there by employing or redeploying those it's physical capital as well as land being a big issue, for renewable energy. So using that space for renewable energy deployment can address land conflict issues as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. We don't have as big a problem in Africa, clearly, but to the extent that there is a problem, how do we sort of rapidly turn these plants off?
I think what I'd like to see, especially ahead coming out of COP this year, is commitments to, we've already got the no new coal commitments, but would really be great to see commitments to terminate projects that are planned or under construction, so that those are not able to go ahead. And there is, of course, lobbying towards that end for COP this year. So I think that would be really one major thing, is if we could talk about this no new coal as also being about those that are in the pipeline at their various stages. The second thing I would say is that I think, of course, as you could see from this panel, we're all very, very clear on, for Sub-Saharan Africa, what investments are needed, where they're needed, and there's a lot of them. But what you're actually seeing, and I'm just going to allude to SEforALL's Understanding the Landscape report, the one from last year actually shows that there's a real mismatch between where there is needed investment and where the investment is actually going. And that's aside from the issue that the total amount is actually not sufficient. So that's another thing I would like to see, is sort of, targeting of investment to where it's really needed. There are challenges, of course, around political instability, the macroeconomics of, exchange rates fluctuation. There's policy and regulatory issues and institutional weakness. Of course, all of that makes for less favorable investment climates that are, due to increased perceived risk. But if we can start to solve some of those issues and get the finance shifted out into where it needs to be, that would be fantastic.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca, and right on time. Unfortunately, we're out of time now, so I'm going to have to close it out. But I'd like to say thanks a million to the panel. Fantastic insights. I've loved having you as panelists. Thank you, Kyle, for all your work on the knowledge brief, And thank you very much to the audience for joining us today. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the recording with you, so please share it around, and the knowledge brief is available. And finally, my comms team tells me that I have to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for funding this work, as well as our other donors, the IKEA Foundation, the Austrian Development Agency, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iceland. So thank you very much for funding us to do this important work. And thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today.